Alright, so now that we've had a chance to take a look at Maya's rendered layers, let's now take a look at something called layer overrides. Alright, so layer overrides tie in directly to the render layers that we've had a chance to take a look at in the previous lesson. So with layer overrides, we can actually turn certain features on or off for individual render layers. Alright, so why would we need to use layer overrides, or what's a perfect example? Alright, let's take, for example, the occlusion pass. Right, so if I take a render of the occlusion pass, you can see that in addition to the calculation itself, Maya's actually using final gather as well. Alright, so occlusion, or this occlusion shader that's being used, does not actually need final gather in order to compute its final result. Alright, so we're actually wasting time by using the final gather. But we don't necessarily need to turn it off because we are using final gather to arrive at the color pass. So what we can do is use a layer override to tell Maya, go ahead and use final gather on the color pass, but once you get to the occlusion pass, don't use any final gather anymore. Alright, so let's go and find this option. Now if you go to the occlusion pass and turn on the render globals, you'll see that a couple of these options are highlighted in orange. Alright, anything that's orange means that there's a layer override currently in effect. So if you want to be able to create a layer override, all you need to do is simply right-click on the attribute that you want. In our case, let's say final gathering. Let's just take this option, right-click, and create layer override. You can see immediately this should turn orange. And now we can turn this option off. So with this layer override in effect, you can see with the occlusion pass, final gathering is turned off. But as soon as I switch back to another pass, final gathering turns back on. Okay, so here's our result if when the final gather was turned on. So we had a result in about 21 seconds. Now with the final gather turned off, we get the same result now in just 16 seconds because we're not wasting the time to cast these final gather points that aren't even going to be used by the shader itself. Alright, another perfect example would be the alpha pass. Alright, we don't necessarily need final gathering in the alpha pass either because we're just calculating the simple outline. So let's do the same thing. Let's right click, create a layer override for the final gathering on the alpha pass, and turn it off. And while we're at it, let's do the same for the depth pass because this shader does not rely on final gathering either. Or actually, we don't necessarily need to do that because there's already a layer override in effect that tells Maya to go and use the Maya software render instead of MentalRay. Alright, so pretty much any option that has text in it, let's say jitter, sample lock, anything, you can just simply right-click on that text and make a layer override. Right? And these options don't necessarily apply to just options that you see here in the render globals. Right? We can also make adjustments to the layer overrides for things like primary visibility and things like that. Right? So I'll switch to, let's say, the color pass layer. And if I select a piece of geometry, go to its attributes, and let's take a look at the floor shape. All right, and if you take a look inside the render stats, all right, this is where you can find the options for whether or not this object is going to cast shadows, whether or not it's going to receive shadows, whether it's going to be primarily visible, in other words, visible to the camera itself, smooth shading, and so on and so forth. Alright, so let's say, for example, that in this particular render, the color pass, let's say I don't want the floor to be visible. Right? If I disable its primary visibility, what should happen is if I go to another layer, well, in our case, it does go ahead and create the layer override for us automatically if we turn something off on a particular layer. Alright, so this is really good. Let's go to the color pass. And what we can do is, with the primary visibility turned off, in this particular render layer, you can see now that the floor is no longer visible, although if you look very closely, you can see that we still have the result of the shadow that was being cast by that floor. So we have a little bit of light blocking that's happening here. So it's calculating the shadow effects from the floor, but by turning this primary visibility off, we've just made the floor itself invisible to the camera. Right? And best of all, because this is on a layer override, as soon as I switch to another layer like the occlusion, or even the depth, and render that out, it still renders. Right? Because on this particular layer, its primary visibility is turned on. Okay, so let's go back to this color pass. Let's make sure that the primary visibility for this layer is turned on. And let's go ahead and right-click and remove that layer override if we're sure we want to have this on for every layer. Alright, so accessing an object's primary visibility or its shadow casting capabilities can be found inside the render stats, and that's good enough if you just have one object. But what if we have a lot of different objects? Let's say all the different pieces of this knife. Alright, now for this particular piece, if I were to adjust the render stats, all it's doing is adjusting the render stats for the last object selected. So how can I adjust the render stats for all of these different objects at one time? Well, we can do that if we have all these objects selected. And if we go to Window, down to General Editor, and take a look inside the Attribute Spreadsheet. Alright, this is where we can make adjustments to the attributes of lots of different objects in one shot. So let's go to the Render tab and look for, let's turn off an object's primary visibility. Alright, so if we set this to 0, that will take all the selected objects and disable their ability to be seen by the camera. So you can see we still have the shadows and the highlights that are being caused by those objects, but the objects themselves are now invisible. So you could either, to turn these back on, type the word on or off. Or if you want to do this a little bit easily, you could just type 1 for on or 0 for off. Alright, now if you wanted to take a particular set of attributes and make a layer override for those, you can actually, in addition to turning things off and on within this attribute spreadsheet, we can make layer overrides for all these objects within this same window. So in order to make a layer override, just go to Layer and Create or Remove Override from Selected. So in our case, just like what we did with the floor, whenever we turn the primary visibility off, it probably went ahead and automatically made a layer override for that. So in our case, let's remove override. And if you wanted to make one from selected, just select this entire column, go to Layer, Create Override for Selected, and then you can turn that off or on. So it should take all of these different objects. Their primary visibility is off on the color layer. If I go to the occlusion, it should be on. Alright, so the ability to create these layer overrides are absolutely invaluable because it lets us enable or disable certain features on these individual render layers, and it really just adds that extra little bit of power to these render layers. It's a capability that really is not matched by any other piece of software out there. And by having the capability to enable or disable features on these individual render layers, we don't have to waste rendering time computing things that we don't necessarily need. Right? So the renders come out faster, we get the job done faster. Right? So that's a look at layer overrides in Maya.